Okay. Hello, my name is Brianna, and this is my presentation on urban limbo, abandoned construction sites as symbols of nothing. So these two pictures, just very quickly, are two abandoned construction sites that I recorded in my neighborhood. The one on the left is the Slauson corridor, and I'll actually be talking about that site quite a bit. And the one on the right is just another constructed site that's right near my house. And both of these projects have been in this kind of suspended state for many years now. The Slauson corridor has been in progress for decades, and this house here for at least 2 to 3 years. So to get started, these two pictures are also just abandoned construction sites in my neighborhood. And I wanted to open with this quote by Kath Weston. She writes about it in her Unsexed chapter, and I thought that it resonated with me. And it's kind of just something to think about over the course of this presentation. One locates its utopia in a past that never was, the other in a future that may never be. So I found this kind of dichotomy to be important, and it kind of inspired a lot of what my paper was about and what my presentation will be about. So I wanted to include it. And just to get started, just a quick agenda, a roadmap of what I'll be talking about today. One, just a little brief overview of how it all got started, just how my project came to be. Two, this idea of limbo, and then this idea that I've coined urban limbo. They're very different, but just a quick explication of the two. And then the second half of the presentation will be using the Weston, Odell, and Rotman readings to kind of aid my understanding of urban limbo, the development of that idea, and how I tie that into nothing. They've all been very helpful in helping me do so, and I wanted to use what they've taught me to kind of bring about this idea and develop this idea further. And then finally, just to end with a brief conclusion and some possible implications of what this all means. It's all theoretical, but how that can help and how that can be kind of a tangible thing to hold on to what is really important to me. So a little on that later. So first, how it all started, kind of how I developed this idea. So this picture here, you've seen it, it's the Slauson corridor. And I was driving home from work one day, and I was thinking about the prompt that was on Brightspace. And in between songs, these words, literally like quintessential intersection of nothing, came up, and I put a map of where I was. So this is Figueroa, and that is Slauson, and this is where that Figueroa corridor is. And I was at that intersection, and it's always a really busy, like traffic jammed intersection. And in a kind of like sarcastic, like silly thing, I was like, this is the literal intersection of nothing. Like nothing goes on here. It's an intersection. And I kind of laughed about it and went about my day. But then when I started thinking a little bit more solidly about this idea, and I went on that walk that the prompt asked us to go on, I ended up here at this intersection again. And I thought of what I had said earlier that day. And then I found myself in front of the Slauson corridor, which is this picture on the right. And then I started thinking more about how that kind of is nothing, and how even like as a joke, it might be nothing because there's nothing going on, but kind of this bigger idea of what that represents. And I thought it to mean this limbo is the first thing that I thought of, mostly because the Slauson corridor was supposed to be the city initiative that connected city routes, like city bus routes, to bike paths for like a push for a more sustainable South LA, which was like a very promising initiative. Everyone in my neighborhood was really on board with it, I guess, decades ago when it was first proposed. But this is all that's been done, and it's been like this for decades now. You see, it's mostly rubble. There's a couple of machines, and it's miles and miles long stretch of just empty railroad and this kind of lingering promise. So that's where I kind of thought of this idea of limbo. And I know we discussed the idea of limbo in terms of like purgatory and this in between in class a little bit. So I held on to the idea and I kind of rolled with it. And so just a little brief overview on limbo, just regular limbo. I added a picture of a guy doing the limbo. I just thought that like that feeling of doing the limbo, like the game, as funny as it is, and it was just kind of a gag picture. I think it's also a really accurate representation of what I mean by urban limbo and what limbo in general means. So the Webster's dictionary, defines it as any in-between place, state, or condition of neglect or oblivion, which is kind of how I view it. But this is obviously in a more traditional religious sense. Limbo was always seen as a place where unbaptized souls go. It's not a place for second chances. It's a place for first chances, which I thought was really interesting, and reflecting on that in my later idea of urban limbo. And even though some scholars argue that limbo might be this lasting state of mortal happiness, if not like eternal divine happiness, there are a couple of different definitions of limbo, but regardless of which one you choose, it's this suspension, right? It's this neglect or oblivion that's in between two solidified ideas. And that's kind of what I went with when I was thinking about urban limbo and abandoned construction sites as an emblem of that. So urban limbo, this is a definition that I came up with in my paper. It's very preliminary. It's just something that made sense to me when I think about what limbo means and what limbo in my community means in this kind of collective state that me and all of my people are in. So I thought of it as both a process and a state of being, the suspended and unresolved space between the tangibility of a community's past, its potential and promised future, and whatever may exist in the present. So this idea makes sense to me when I think about limbo on its face. Limbo is not the past, like this picture here, this black and white picture is what that corridor used to look like back when the railroads were functioning. And then this picture here at the bottom with the graffiti is what the Slauson corridor looks now. You can see someone walking down this really, really long stretch of road, which a lot of urban blight, the state of the present. And then here on the left is this, the city's rendition of what they promised the Slauson corridor to be. This kind of really energized, fun, green space. As we know, green spaces are significantly lacking in underprivileged communities. So they wanted to create that for the community in this big promise that they've been holding for decades. So when I think of urban limbo, I don't think that it's any of these things. I'd consider it something here in the middle, this tangible, this intangible, this suspended space between these three ideas, between the past, the future, promised future, and the present, differing a little bit from the more religious idea of limbo. And so I wanted to connect the idea of urban limbo to nothing, the topic of our course. And in doing so, the Weston reading really helped me solidify this idea of urban limbo as a suspended moment between like two definitives. So Weston speaks a little bit about limbo and absence. She defines unsexed as a vanishing, not something you are, but a fleeting moment of being called out of one sex before being called into another gender position. So obviously she's speaking about it in terms of gender, but when I think about that vanishing, that fleeting moment, I wouldn't argue that urban limbo is fleeting. I argue that it's a process, and it can also be a state of being. It's a little bit more, I would consider it not so much as fleeting, but like a constant state, but also a process, because it doesn't always have to be this way. There doesn't have to be this urban limbo, this urban blight, these abandoned spaces, mostly because of the second point that Weston talks about, the idea of zero, Rotman's idea of zero, and how it marks absence and perhaps nothingness, but at the same time, it holds a place for and represents the potential for future signification. And so I thought that idea was really inspiring when I think about not zero or in sex, but the idea of urban limbo, and how even though urban limbo also revolves around an absence and also speaks to that kind of fluid, very fleeting moment, it can also represent the potential for something else, for progress, for something that is not what it is. So thinking of it more as a process than just a moment. And then Weston included this quote that I thought was very interesting, and I wanted to talk a little bit about it to kind of lead into the further ideas in my presentation. She says that there always exists a history to banish doubt in the pursuit of clarity. So she talks about spaces and sites having history, and that's very true when I think about the sites that I'm speaking of and the community that I'm referring to. There is a history, but I don't know that I would agree that spaces always have a history to banish doubt, and I take doubt to mean ambiguity. in the pursuit of clarity or something more solidified. That's definitely true for unsexed, and it's definitely true for zero. But I would argue that in South LA, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I put a little X here, and to kind of speak on why I think that and what that means in general. The Jenny Odell reading actually helped me define that. So in her talk, How to Do Nothing, she talks about this bookshelf metaphor when she's speaking of her art and how someone pointed out that all of her art is just putting things on shelves. She said that, yeah, that's basically all she does. She hopes that by putting things on shelves, she can set a new light on different objects, and in manipulating the context of it, she can create a new perspective and kind of bring them back to light, that this idea of a revival. And so here on the right, I have a picture of the art exhibit she had, and she mentioned in her talk in San Francisco, and how these are all just objects from the dump that she's shed in a new light. And she hopes that people will think of them differently, and they'll mean something to different people based on the context that she's providing. So tying this all back into urban limbo and urban blights, I think of urban limbo and the state, urban limbo being the state of my community. I think of it as if someone had put the community on a half shelf. So it's as if Odell had, or anyone had put this community onto a shelf. And instead of reorganizing, restructuring, and shedding new light on it, it's kind of just there. It's in this state of limbo. Construction sites are always known for building, for constructing, for creating something new. So when you have an abandonment to that site, you no longer have the past because it's in the process of being something new, but it's abandoned. So it's no longer holding that potential that it was promised. And it's not the present either, because you know that that's not what it is truly now because of that suspended state. So it's in that limbo. So this bookshelf metaphor and thinking of a community on a bookshelf without the light being shed on it gives me a really tangible way to think of urban limbo, and tying that to the idea of nothing was really helpful. And then second, more on urban limbo as nothing, Brian Rotman's signifying nothing was very, very helpful, because I also started to think of urban limbo as a meta sign. So we've spoken so much about meta signs in the class. As you know, it's a sign of a sign. But something that I found very interesting that Rotman was, a point that Rotman was trying to make, is that meta signs are made and remade repeatedly. They come into being and they persist by virtue of human agency. So when I wanted to make that claim that urban limbo was in a way a meta sign of many things, and even a meta sign of nothing, I didn't know if that truly could be a thing, because this urban limbo is a feeling developed by a community, developed by me for a community. But the idea that a meta sign can be made and persisted by virtue of human agency really stuck out to me, because if it is so, then what's more human than this kind of human collective feeling of creating urban limbo as a meta sign, and a meta sign for nothing. So that's where the second half of this idea comes into. So like urban limbo, meta signs are structured around the idea of an absence. I spoke a little bit earlier about Weston and absence, the idea that there is a void there. There is an absence. There is a yearning. So urban limbo, obviously, it's the legitimate absence of something promised, of an abandoned site that has nothing there but rubble. And meta signs also have that absence, just like the number 0, the absence of a number. We talked about that in class a lot. So thinking of the idea of urban limbo and meta signs surrounding this idea of absence really helps me tie it into that idea of nothing a little bit more. But then I was still kind of at a loss in this thought process, because I didn't understand how I could tie in urban limbo to like 0, like an idea like 0, and then an idea of like a conscious political feeling. And then Robert Smithson's piece on the provisional theory of non-sites actually really helped me in a weird way. So I will explain. So in sites and non-sites, Smithson speaks a little bit about non-sites as this like 3-dimensional metaphor that ties actual solid sites to what he created as a non-site. So this picture here is his rendition of a non-site on the right. it's that collection of rocks in that shelf. And then on the wall there are pictures of actual sites in New Jersey that he's trying to represent by the creation of this non-site. So this non-site obviously doesn't resemble the site at all, but it's a connection. There's a connection between the two. It's emblematic of that idea, even though they are in different forms. So when I think of non-sites or construction sites, I can still tie in that idea of this non-site, of this limboed site, to something a little bit more like solidified, like an actual site. So it helps me connect urban limbo and meta signs in the sense that even though they may not resemble each other, they may not have that same foundational basis, I can still connect them, at least theoretically, to this idea of nothing, which really helped me because I didn't want all of this to be kind of theoretical. I wanted to have more of like a solidified idea of what that might mean. And especially when you think about conclusions and implications for a community, equating it to nothing, how is that useful? So Smithson really helped me solidify those ideas. And then in terms of graphics, the yellow, this is a sign, is just a sign of signs. I thought that was funny, so I put it in there. And then so lastly, just some general conclusions / implications. So I've spoken a lot about urban limbo, urban blight, and these abandoned construction spaces. And I wanted to put those ideas forward and equate them to nothing, or to show how they can be emblems of nothing. And obviously, if I'm speaking of my community and the state of my community and my people, how is that helpful? Like, how is equating something to nothing helpful, even though we've learned in this class that nothing doesn't necessarily have to be a negative? I did want to have some sort of connection between this idea of urban limbo as nothing and what that can mean. So I thought back to the idea of Rotman Zero and how Rotman Zero completely changed the political economy, obviously through geometry and through like merchant trade he speaks about in his book. So I think of the idea of zero, a meta sign, an emblem of nothing, changing something to that extent. And I think, well, if a meta sign can do that, and if urban limbo is a meta sign, then what can urban limbo achieve as a meta sign? And so in my paper, I write, I'm going to read off of it. Bouncing off this idea, if urban limbo can truly act as a meta sign of nothing, there births the opportunity to place communities like mine onto a real shelf instead of this idea of a half shelf. If we do so, we might be able to change the perception of how we view urban blight or these abandoned spaces and what that can and might mean to us in the future. So it can help us shed light on underserved communities and this kind of idea of limbo, and maybe shift the political direction of progress and how we view the urban landscape. And I know that's very broad, and it may not mean much because, again, this is just an idea, but if Odell is right that we can restructure the context and manipulate context to create new ideas, then maybe these states of limbo, as these are all different pictures of construction sites, maybe they don't have to mean nothing in the sense that they're in this suspension. If urban limbo is a process, and processes and meta signs can change tangible things, then it can help us view, or at least help me view, the communities that I live in a different light, and kind of restructure the way I think about where I live. And even if it doesn't do any of that, and that's really far-fetched, it definitely helps me deepen my notions of nothing and how to connect nothing to my community, and kind of this like greater idea of like this urban revitalization that I've been studying in school. So it really helped me, at least personally, if not providing a tangible, very straightforward conclusion to something. I think that at least this resonated with me enough and was special enough to put into my presentation. And then lastly, the last picture in the middle is just a rock saying thank you, just because I feel like the rocks, or the idea of rocks, have followed us throughout the whole semester. So I wanted to say thank you for this opportunity. I hope that this presentation helps aid the photos and helps aid the paper that I wrote, and provide a little bit more context onto this weird idea of urban limbo and this weird idea of nothing and how they might connect to each other. So thank you.